A black CEO was denied luxury food in first class, and 10 minutes later, he fired the entire cabin crew. Savage. Franklin Morgan, a 46-year-old tech billionaire and founder of Stratosight Systems, stepped onto Starglide Air Flight 863 with the quiet confidence of a man who has built empires from scratch. Clad in a tailored gray blazer, crisp jeans, and his signature noise-canceling headphones, he carried no entourage, no fanfare, just the weight of a billion-dollar acquisition waiting for him in Osaka. It was supposed to be a smooth red-eye across the Pacific, the kind of flight where first class meant luxury without compromise, but when a simple meal request turned into a subtle yet undeniable moment of disrespect. The cabin crew had no idea that the man they had just brushed off was one of the airline's most powerful silent investors, and he didn't come to play. Franklin Morgan settled into Seat 1C aboard Starglide Air Flight 863, the flagship Trans-Pacific route from Seattle to Osaka. At 46, the black tech mogul had long mastered the art of blending in while standing apart, known throughout Silicon Valley and beyond for building Stratosight Systems into a multi-billion-dollar empire. Franklin wasn't one for flashy displays. He wore success like a second skin, subtle, sharp, and calculated. Tonight, he wore a steel gray blazer over a navy crew neck, slim jeans, and polished Chelsea boots. His carry-on was a black leather satchel, scuffed at the edges from years of international deal-making. On paper, he looked like any seasoned traveler, but beneath the surface lay a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms, managing crises, and navigating spaces where he was often the only one who looked like him. Starglide Air had been his airline of choice for more than a decade, and he always flew first class. Quietly, consistently, and with precision, the airline knew his preferences. Early boarding, Seat 1C, and the premium multi-course sea-based dinner paired with a Junmai Daijinjo sake. It wasn't about the food. It was about the principle. After thousands of flight hours, certain expectations weren't a luxury, they were earned. Tonight's flight had 7 other first-class passengers, white male executives in their 40s and 50s, most of whom were chatting about hedge funds, exchange rates, and who was getting acquired next in Osaka. Franklin had overheard one of them. A loud man with a gold tie name-dropped the exact company Stratosight was about to purchase. He gave no reaction, just adjusted his noise-canceling headphones and returned to reviewing his presentation slides. The cabin had the usual luxury ambience. Dim overhead lighting, subtle ambient music, and the scent of fresh eucalyptus from the warm towels passed out at boarding. But even in this curated comfort, there was tension. Franklin could sense a quiet barrier that often existed in these spaces, one that didn't need to be named to be felt. It was in the way the flight attendant glanced at his boarding pass twice, in the slight pause before offering him the welcome drink, in the way the crew smiled just a little more earnestly at the others. He'd been here before, in rooms, lounges, flights, where his presence caused a glitch in someone else's assumptions. But Franklin didn't flinch. He never did. He had built his life on absorbing friction and turning it into momentum. As the engines hummed deeper, preparing for takeoff, Franklin sank into his seat, glancing out the window at the glittering runway lights. In his mind, he wasn't on a flight. He was already in Osaka, sitting across from the board of the Japanese firm he planned to acquire, presenting the final numbers, sealing the legacy deal of his career. But something small, subtle, and unnecessary was about to interrupt that focus. Something that didn't register as a threat at first glance. Not until the moment it happened. Not until that glass of sake never came. Not until the attendant leaned in, apologizing with a smile too stiff to be sincere, and said the words that would quietly unravel the next 10 minutes of her career and change the course of the entire flight. The cabin had settled into its usual rhythm. Seat belts off, glasses filled, quiet chatter drifting between rows. When the moment unfolded, Heather Langston, one of the lead flight attendants, approached Franklin with a tight-lipped smile and an energy that lacked the warmth typically extended to first-class patrons. "Apologies, sir," she said, her tone clipped and rehearsed. "It looks like the premium meal options have already been claimed. We'll bring you a sandwich instead. Roast turkey or vegetarian?" He didn't wait for a reply before she turned on her heel. leaving behind a faint scent of perfume and an even fainter impression of respect. Franklin blinked slowly, unsure whether he had misheard or if this was just the airline's idea of a joke. He had pre-ordered the premium Seabase course, a menu he'd selected through Starglide's mobile concierge service 3 days ago, just like he always did. And while he didn't travel for the perks, there was a matter of principle in being treated as promised, especially in a cabin where luxury was supposed to be the baseline, not the exception. Less than 5 minutes later, his attention was pulled to the aisle 2 rows ahead, where he watched Heather personally present the miso-glazed Seabase. His Seabase, to a man with silver hair, a navy power suit, and a Cartier watch glinting under the overhead lights. Franklin's gaze narrowed. That man hadn't pre-ordered. In fact, he had boarded late and seemed unsure whether he even wanted fish. But there he was, nodding with approval as Heather poured him a crisp glass of Junmai sake and asked if he wanted extra yuzu on the side. No explanation had been given to Franklin. No effort to recover the situation. Just a dry sandwich and a lukewarm bottle of water dropped on his tray with mechanical efficiency. 10 minutes later, when Heather finally passed by again, he stopped her with a quiet but firm question. Was there an issue with my meal request? Her response was breezy, borderline indifferent. Oh, it must have glitched in the system. Happens sometimes. We prioritize our most loyal guests during inventory constraints. Hope you understand. Then she smiled. Not a kind smile, but the kind someone gives when they think they've said something too subtle to challenge. Franklin didn't respond. He didn't need to. In that one exchange, the truth had become unmistakably clear. The meal had been withheld not because of availability, but because of assumption. Assumption about who belonged in this cabin and who didn't. Assumption about who was worth the Seabase and who was worth the sandwich. The irony, of course, was brutal. Not only was Franklin a Platinum Elite member with over a decade of loyalty to Starglide Air, but he was also one of its private shareholders, quietly holding a seat on the advisory committee for luxury experience development. Heather didn't know that, of course. To her, he was just another tired black man in a nice seat. And while Franklin was used to being underestimated in boardrooms, on trading floors, and in elite golf clubs, there was something about this moment. Its casualness, its repetition, its quiet cruelty, that struck a different nerve. This wasn't about food. It wasn't about 5-star service. It was about dignity. And what Heather didn't realize was that the man she had just dismissed wasn't simply going to file a complaint and move on. He had a longer memory and a much longer reach. Franklin didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or signal offense. Instead, with the calm precision of a man who'd long learned the power of stillness, he tapped twice on the surface of his smart ring, an innocuous gesture that activated Silent Trace Protocol, a confidential internal oversight system he'd personally helped Starglide Air develop during a pilot phase last quarter, designed to assess service quality in premium cabins. The program discreetly recorded audio and video, tagging crew interactions based on tone, duration, and keyword detection. The technology had been installed quietly in select aircraft, meant to protect high-value passengers from mistreatment and protect staff from false claims. Tonight, it would do both. While sipping his lukewarm water, Franklin opened his tablet beneath the tray table and launched a secure interface, sending an encrypted prompt to his chief of staff, Danielle Avery, at his Singapore office. Danielle, a former intelligence analyst, didn't need instructions. She began pulling records fast. Within minutes, she flagged Heather's employee profile, her record riddled with 4 prior passenger complaints, racially coded remarks, subtle refusals of service, inconsistent application of privileges, all quietly dismissed by a supervisor named Miles Rennick, a mid-level manager in guest services, who had flagged each complaint as guest misinterpretation before closing the case. Danielle's cursor paused over the name, then clicked once more. The system cross-referenced flight manifests. That's when the twist emerged. Miles Rennick was on this flight. Not in coach, not somewhere untraceable. He was sitting in seat 2A, directly behind Franklin. A quick glance back during boarding now made perfect sense. The slightly startled look on Miles's face. The awkward half-nod when their eyes met. Franklin hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Starglide execs traveled often. Now the pieces snapped into place like gears in a watch. Miles had personally buried Heather's misconduct records and was now a bystander to her latest act. Unaware that this particular guest had both the motive and means to expose them both, Franklin allowed himself a slow exhale. His eyes never leaving the glowing screen of his tablet, he activated the timestamp tagging feature in SilentTrace protocol, marking the precise interaction where Heather denied him service. The system would now isolate every moment involving her, syncing it with facial recognition and sentiment tracking. As the flight attendants moved about the cabin, laughing with other passengers and pouring wine with practiced ease, Franklin remained still, silent, composed, but coiled with focus. Franklin reviewed Heather's complaint summaries again. One noted a guest's comment that her smile disappears when it's someone who doesn't match her version of a first-class flyer. Another referenced an incident where she skipped over a well-dressed black couple on a New York to London route. Patterns, repetition, bias, all ignored until now. Danielle sent over Miles's internal performance reviews next. They were glowing. Efficient, loyal, excellent conflict manager. But there was something buried in the metadata. A deleted internal memo referencing the suppression of sensitive bias reports in order to protect brand continuity. Franklin's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what that meant. They had built a culture where image mattered more than accountability. But they'd made one critical mistake. They let the wrong man experience it firsthand. And now both Heather and Miles were on a flight that would land with more than luggage waiting. There would be consequences, silent, swift, and surgical. The footage was damning, clean, time-stamped, and irrefutable. The SilentTrace protocol had done its job with brutal precision. Franklin reviewed the clips on his tablet in near silence, his eyes tracking the subtleties of tone, gesture, and dismissiveness that couldn't be explained away by policy or miscommunication. One clip showed Heather glancing toward his seat before quietly exchanging whispers with a fellow attendant. "He probably got on standby," she muttered with a smirk, and they both chuckled as she walked past Franklin with the untouched sea-base meal. That wasn't negligence. That was intent. But the next clip hit harder, captured from a mic embedded near the galley. It recorded a passing comment from the co-pilot, unaware that surveillance was active and completely oblivious to who was seated in 1C. "Let him write a complaint like everyone else," said Captain Ron Barlow with a casual shrug. "It's not like it'll go anywhere." His voice was thick with the kind of entitlement that assumes immunity, the kind bred in systems that value loyalty over accountability. Franklin paused the video. That sentence, simple and smug, revealed everything. Not just bias, but the quiet complicity that allowed it to thrive. This wasn't just about Heather anymore. It was about a culture that protected itself from scrutiny by assuming its worst behavior would remain in the shadows. Not tonight. With one swipe, Franklin packaged the footage, the audio logs, and a metadata summary of flagged behavior and uploaded it through a secure satellite link to Starglide Air's global ethics board. The file was labeled Protocol Alert 7C Alpha. Immediate review requested. At the other end, in a sleek office in Chicago's Loop, a red alert pinged on the terminal of Dana Prescott, the airline's chief ethics officer. She recognized the sender's ID before she even opened the file. Her breath caught when Franklin Morgan flagged something personally. It wasn't performative. It was an unspoken warning that demanded swift internal alignment, because the next stop was the boardroom and then the media. Franklin didn't need to follow up. His name alone carried weight. As the upload completed, he sat back in his seat, slipping his tablet into the front pocket of his blazer. The cabin around him remained unaware. Passengers sipped their wine. Heather handed out dessert without the slightest suspicion that every step she took was being logged. Even Miles Rennick, the manager seated just behind him, chuckled at a business article on his tablet, blissfully ignorant of the digital sword now hanging over his head. Franklin gave no signal, no indication of the storm quietly forming. But when Danielle's encrypted message came through with a single word, "Confirmed," he gave a small nod, one only he would recognize as the silent go-ahead. The timing was exact. The footage would reach the executive chain within 5 minutes. HR would be alerted. Personnel records would be frozen. By the time the aircraft touched down in Osaka, The necessary teams would already be in motion. He didn't need to confront anyone midair. He didn't need to raise his voice or stage a scene. That was never his style. The power wasn't in spectacle. It was in precision. Starglide's internal systems had already begun to shift. Triggered by his authority, his evidence, and his silence. The plane hadn't even landed yet, but careers were already over. Reputations were already erased, and the people who thought they were untouchable were about to learn that when quiet men act, they don't make noise. They make history. 10 minutes before descent, an encrypted directive pulsed through Starglide Air's internal chain of command like a detonator being triggered. HR systems flagged the crew of Flight 863 for immediate review, their digital access frozen midair. By the time the aircraft's wheels touched down at Kansai International Airport, a coordinated response team was already in place, her corporate HR officers dressed in plain black suits, flanked by 2 senior Starglide executives in Navy travel blazers, boarded the plane through the service entrance just as the aircraft taxied to the gate. Without disrupting the flow of disembarkation, flight attendants were calmly instructed to remain seated until a standard procedural review was complete. Passengers, unaware of the storm churning beneath the surface, gathered their designer carry-ons and exited with the usual murmurs of business-class pleasantries. Only when the last civilian stepped off did the tone of the cabin shift. Heather, still wearing her practice smile, stood halfway down the aisle with her hands clasped neatly. She hadn't noticed the executives yet. She was too busy checking the galley for leftover wine splits. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Franklin rise. Calm, poised, silent. He stepped into the aisle, adjusted the lapel of his blazer, and walked toward the exit, passing Heather without haste until he stopped just inches from her shoulder. He turned slightly, met her gaze with the quiet intensity of a man who had already written the final chapter, and said 5 words that would haunt her career forever. "You prioritized the wrong guest." There was no anger in his tone, no accusation, just fact delivered like a signature on a verdict. Heather's eyes darted past him, taking in the HR team standing just feet away, tablets in hand, expressionless. Her breath caught. The silence in the cabin became unbearable, the air too thick to inhale. Behind her, the other 3 crew members exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly aware that something was very, very wrong. One of the HR officers stepped forward, voice low but firm. "Cabin Team 863, please remain in your assigned jump seats. We'll begin individual debriefs immediately. This is a formal employment action." Heather's smile cracked as the color drained from her face. She looked to Miles Rennick, seated just 1 row back. He had stood up, gripping the back of the seat for support, confusion turning to dread as he recognized the executives now entering behind the HR staff. He opened his mouth to speak, but a woman in a navy blazer, Starglide's Director of Internal Affairs, raised a hand. "Mr. Rennick, your access to company systems has been suspended. You will be escorted to a secure interview suite upon disembarkation." His shoulders dropped. Heather stumbled backward a half step, barely keeping her composure. Franklin didn't stop walking. He exited the aircraft as quietly as he had entered it, his presence now a force felt in the space he left behind. Behind him, for careers unraveled with corporate efficiency, terminated midair, airport credentials revoked, and reputations erased before the crew even reached baggage claim. No spectacle, no drama, just a silent reckoning carried out by a man who understood that power doesn't need volume. It needs precision. And that night, Franklin Morgan had been nothing short of surgical. 3 days after Flight 863 touched down in Osaka, Starglide Air released a public statement that sent ripples through the industry. The airline announced immediate and sweeping changes across its global operations. Mandatory bias and equity training for all cabin and corporate staff, the launch of a confidential whistleblower system for passengers and employees, and the implementation of a new set of service standards called the Morgan Standard, named in quiet tribute to the man who demanded change without ever raising his voice. The press called it a turning point. Industry leaders called it a model, but Franklin Morgan called it overdue. He didn't grant interviews, he didn't post on social media. He simply kept moving, as he always had. letting results speak louder than reactions. A week later, on a routine flight from Boston to Seattle, he boarded Starglide again. This time greeted by a young, newly hired flight attendant whose name tag read Maya. Her voice was calm but reverent as she handed him a folded note with his welcome drink. "Mr. Morgan," she said softly, "this is from the team." He opened it quietly and read the handwritten message inside. "We're proud to serve all our guests equally. Thank you for raising the standard." There was no corporate letterhead, no scripted marketing slogan, just sincerity in ink. Franklin folded the note once, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and nodded with a rare, almost imperceptible smile. He didn't need recognition. What he needed, what he fought for, was something much deeper. A culture where respect wasn't rationed based on skin color, status, or assumption. Where luxury wasn't defined by sea base or sake, but by dignity. In the silence of cruising altitude, he glanced around the cabin, noticing the ease with which passengers were being served. Diverse faces, equally valued, quietly seen, and for the first time in a long time it felt like the system had moved, even if just an inch in the right direction. The lesson, simple but seismic, hung in the air like a quiet declaration. Respect isn't a favor, it's a standard. When systems fail to protect dignity, power must speak quietly, decisively, and for everyone watching. If this story moved you, made you think, or simply reminded you that quiet strength can spark real change, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We share powerful, thought-provoking stories every week that shine a light on dignity, justice, and what it truly means to lead with purpose. Stay inspired, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the smallest moments create the loudest impact. Subscribe now so you never miss the next story that just might change how you see the world.